Snow fell like a judgment, silent and final. The town of Redemption didn't just turn them out, it erased them. One minute, Annie Mae Carter and her mother Martha were a part of the town. The next, they were ghosts, standing where the main street dissolved into a sea of white. Behind them, every door was shut. Every window was a blind eye. A curtain twitched, then fell still. Done. Her mother Martha leaned on a crooked stick, her breath a ragged cloud in the freezing air. She was a wisp of a thing, all brittle bones and white hair, but her hand gripped Annie Mae's sleeve with a strength born of pure desperation. "Come on, Mama," Annie Mae whispered, her own voice trembling. "We'll keep moving." They stumbled past the last boardwalk post. The sign for the general store creaked, a funeral groan in the wind. "Welcome," the peeling letters lied. A few townsfolk watched from their doorways, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes were sharp, their whispers were sharper. "Good riddance," a voice hissed, carried on the wind. "Two mouths we don't have to feed." It was Pearl McKinn's voice. Of course it was. Pearl, with her pious face and poisoned tongue. Shame burned Annie Mae's cheeks, a fire in the ice. At the edge of town, Sheriff Amos Fletcher stood like a statue. His coat was pulled tight, his hat brim low. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The Colt, .45 on his hip, said it all. This wasn't just a departure, it was an execution. His eyes met Annie Mae's. There was no cruelty in them, just a deep settled weariness. The look of a man who'd decided mercy was a price he wasn't willing to pay. "You best be gone before dark," he said, his voice low. And then he turned and walked away. The prairie opened up before them, an endless empty page. Snow swirled, biting at Annie Mae's ankles through the cracks in her worn-out boots. She clutched the small bundle she carried, 2 bowls, a thin blanket, and a single loaf of bread. It wasn't much to show for a lifetime. She thought about the last few hours. The locked church doors. The shopkeeper shaking his head. The town turning its back, one by one. They saw a girl chained to a dying mother. They saw a burden. But what did they really see? What were they so afraid of? The cold started to sink deep into her bones. Her mother stumbled, her knees buckling. Annie Mae caught her, lowering her gently into the snow. "Go on," Martha wheezed, her lips blue. "Leave me. Save yourself." "Never," Annie Mae breathed, pressing her forehead to her mother's. "You're all I've got." A single tear slid down Martha's cheek and froze solid. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Annie Mae's throat. They couldn't stay here. The night would claim them. She had to find shelter. She hauled her mother to her feet and plunged forward into the white. The world was a blur of snow and sky. That's when she saw him. A dark shape against the pines. Tall, still, a rifle across his back. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A bandit? An outlaw? He moved closer, a big, shaggy dog trotting at his heels. His face was hidden by a thick beard and the shadow of his hat. He stopped a few feet away, saying nothing. His gaze moved from Annie Mae's desperate face to her mother's frail form. He was a stranger from the wild. What mercy could he possibly offer when her own neighbors had offered none? Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble, almost lost in the wind. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. Annie Mae's breath caught. She stared at him, searching for the trick, the angle. But there was nothing, just a strange, unsettling stillness. Her numb fingers lost their grip on the bundle. The bread tumbled out, a dark spot against the pure white snow. The man turned without waiting for an answer and strode toward the trees. For a heartbeat, Annie Mae was frozen. To follow him was to leap into an unknown darkness, but to stay here was certain death. Her mother sagged against her, a dead weight. The decision was made. Annie Mae grabbed the fallen stick and, with the last of her strength, followed the stranger into the forest. The falling snow quickly covered their tracks, wiping them from the world. The cabin was made of dark, ancient logs, and it looked like it had grown right out of the forest floor. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin, gray promise of warmth. The man, this stranger, pushed the door open and stepped aside. Heat washed over Annie Mae's frozen face. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and a deep, masculine quiet. Without a word, he guided her mother to a chair by the fire. His hands, though large and calloused, were surprisingly gentle. He ladled a thin hot broth into a wooden bowl and set it in front of her. Martha's trembling hands lifted the bowl to her lips. He set a second bowl on the table for Annie Mae. She hesitated. Accepting his help felt like admitting she had failed, but the warmth of the cabin was a powerful argument. She sat, and the broth burned a trail of life all the way down to her empty stomach. He didn't eat. He just watched them from the shadows, his dog curled at his feet. "I'm Annie Mae Carter," she finally said, her voice cracking. "This is my mother, Martha." "Jedediah Boone," he replied. He said it like a man who wasn't used to speaking his own name. He nodded once, and the matter was settled. The storm trapped them there for days. The world shrank to the four walls of that cabin. Jedediah was a man of few words and constant motion. He chopped wood, mended drafts, checked his traps. He moved with a quiet purpose that filled the small space. Annie Mae, desperate to earn their keep, fell into her own rhythm. She scrubbed, she mended, she tended the fire. She was trying to prove she wasn't a burden. She was trying to fight off the shame that clung to her like a shroud. One evening, a trapper passing through stopped for shelter. He was a man with a loose tongue and a cruel sense of humor. "Heard about you, Carters," the trapper said, grinning at Annie Mae over his bowl of stew. "Town says you ran straight into the arms of the mountain man. Guess desperation makes for a quick wedding." Hot shame flooded Annie Mae's face. She couldn't look at Jedediah. She waited for him to agree, to laugh, to cast them out. Instead, he just stood up, scraped his bowl clean, and went outside to split more wood. His silence was a shield. He refused to even acknowledge the poison. Later, after the trapper was gone, she watched Jedediah mending a snare, his scarred hands moving with a patient, steady rhythm. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation, and that steady calm was more unsettling than any threat. It was a quiet kind of respect. Their days took on a pattern, a language of shared tasks instead of words. He taught her how to swing an axe, his hand over hers, guiding her motion. She tended to his dog's injured paw, her whispers a soft counterpoint to the cabin's silence. But the peace was fragile. Winter was a relentless beast. One night, Martha collapsed. A fever raged through her frail body. "We need a doctor!" Annie Mae cried, her voice thin with panic. "Jedediah, please, we have to go back to town." He knelt by the cot, his hand on Martha's forehead. "The roads are gone," he said, his voice grim. "We do what we can. Here." He worked through the night, a silent, steady force. He boiled herbs, he heated cloths, he held Martha's hand when the shaking got too bad. Annie Mae felt her own fear start to recede, anchored by his calm. By dawn, the storm had broken, and so had the fever. Relief washed over Annie Mae, so powerful it brought her to her knees. She looked at Jedediah, his face gray with exhaustion, and she saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't just a rescuer. He was a guardian, a man who had chosen to carry their weight as if it were his own. But the question still haunted her. Why? Spring arrived in hesitant whispers. The snow melted, the creeks thawed. Martha was weak, but she was alive. Annie Mae felt the sun on her face and stood a little taller. The shame of her exile was beginning to feel like a distant memory. One afternoon, she found Jedediah at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley. She stood beside him, and for a long moment, they just watched the world wake up. He turned to her, his eyes serious. "You belong here," he said. The words weren't a proposal. They weren't a claim. They were a statement of fact, an offering. And in that moment, Annie Mae felt a fragile hope take root in her heart. She looked back at the cabin, her mother a small, determined figure in the doorway, and then at the man beside her. This man who had saved them. This man who was a mystery. She was about to find out that Jedediah Boone had his own ghosts, and his past was tangled up with the very town that had cast her out. The quiet life they had built was about to be shattered. Because the trapper hadn't just brought gossip that night. He'd brought a message. And Jedediah had been lying to her the entire time. The lie came apart piece by piece. It started with the sheriff's name. One evening, as Martha drifted in a half-sleep, she murmured something from her past. Fletcher. He promised he'd protect us. Promised Thomas. Annie Mae froze. She'd told Jedediah the sheriff's name was Fletcher, but he had never reacted. He'd acted as if the name meant nothing. A cold suspicion began to creep into her thoughts. Then, while cleaning out the small root cellar, her fingers brushed against a loose stone in the wall. Behind it was a small hidden hollow. Tucked inside was a leather pouch. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It didn't contain money. It held a folded, yellowed piece of paper. A land deed. It was for 160 acres of prime timberland. The very land the town of Redemption was built on. But the name on the deed wasn't one of the town founders. The name was Thomas Carter, her father. And the date was just 2 years before he died. Her father had been a poor farmer. He'd never owned more than a rock-strewn plot of land. How could he have owned the whole valley? The truth, when it came, was from Martha. In a moment of clarity, her old memories sharp and clear, she told the story. Your father wasn't a farmer, Annie Mae. He was a surveyor. He found the pass through the mountains. He charted this whole valley. The railroad paid him in land. This land. Her voice grew weaker, laced with old pain. When he died, I was alone. Pearl McKinn's husband. He was the banker then. He told me the deed was worthless, that the railroad had defaulted. He offered me a pittance for it, enough to buy our little house in town. I was a widow. I didn't understand. I signed it over. But you kept the original deed? Annie Mae whispered, her heart pounding. Thomas always said, never trust a banker who smiles too much. He told me to hide the real one, just in case. The whole ugly truth clicked into place. Pearl McKinn hadn't just been cruel. She'd been a thief. The entire town of Redemption was built on a lie, on a stolen piece of paper. And now, they knew Martha was sick. They knew she might start talking, her mind wandering back to the past. They couldn't risk the truth coming out. So they'd used her health as an excuse. They hadn't just cast them out to save on food. They had exiled them to protect a crime. Annie Mae felt a white-hot rage that burned away every last trace of her shame. They hadn't been a burden. They had been a threat. But the biggest piece of the puzzle was still missing. Jedediah. That night, she confronted him. She laid the deed on the table between them. My father owned this valley. He looked at the deed, then at her. His face was a mask of stone. I know. The confession was a quiet thunderclap in the small cabin. Who are you? She demanded, her voice shaking. Really? He was quiet for a long time, the fire crackling in the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a past he had tried to bury. Your father and I were partners, Jedediah said. We surveyed this land together. He was the only honest man I ever knew. When he died, I was out west. By the time I got back, it was too late. McKinn had already stolen the land and started selling off plots. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. I tried to fight it, legally. But McKinn owned the judge, the sheriff, everyone. They ran me out of town, labeled me a troublemaker, an outlaw. He turned back to her, and she saw a deep, ancient pain in his eyes. I never left. I've been living out here for 15 years. Watching. Waiting. For a chance to make it right. To give you back what's yours. He had known who she was the moment he saw her in the snow. He hadn't rescued a stranger. He had been looking for her. The trapper hadn't come by chance. Jedediah had sent for him to get news from the town, to find out if they were still alive. The world tilted on its axis. Every act of kindness, every shared silence, was suddenly cast in a new light. He hadn't been protecting her from the winter. He'd been protecting her from the town. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because the truth would have put you in more danger," he said grimly. "And because you had to learn to trust me first. Not as your father's partner, but as me." But now, the game had changed. The trapper had told the town they were still alive. Pearl McKinn and Sheriff Fletcher knew their secret wasn't buried in the snow. They would be coming. Not with whispers this time. With guns. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, at dawn, Jedediah's dog let out a low, warning growl. From his vantage point in the trees, Jedediah saw them, a posse of 5 men, led by Sheriff Fletcher himself, picking their way up the mountain trail. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Annie Mae's heart leaped into her throat, but the fear was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She grabbed the old shotgun Jedediah had taught her to use. Martha, surprisingly steady, began barricading the door with a heavy wooden chest. "They think they're coming to silence a sick old woman and a helpless girl," Martha said, her voice thin but strong as iron. "They're in for a surprise." The first shot wasn't from the posse. It was from Jedediah. A warning shot that kicked up snow just in front of the sheriff's horse. "That's far enough, Fletcher." Jedediah's voice boomed across the valley. The posse scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees. "Boone!" the sheriff yelled back. "We just want the women. Don't have to be any trouble." "They're not going anywhere!" Jedediah yelled. The firefight erupted, the crack of rifles echoing off the mountains. Jedediah was a ghost in the trees, moving from cover to cover, his shots precise and deadly. From the cabin, Annie Mae fired the shotgun whenever a man got too close, the buckshot tearing through the underbrush. They were outnumbered, but they had the high ground. And they were fighting for more than just land. They were fighting for their lives, for their honor. The siege lasted for hours. One of the posse went down, clutching his leg. Another's rifle was splintered by one of Jedediah's shots. But the sheriff was smart. He sent 2 of his men on a wide circle to come at the cabin from behind. It was Martha who saw them first. She let out a sharp cry of warning. Jedediah was pinned down. Annie Mae was reloading. The 2 men were closing in on the cabin's unprotected rear wall. Just as one of them kicked in the back door, a new sound split the air. Not a gunshot, a twang. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, sprouted from the man's chest. He crumpled without a sound. His partner spun around, confused, and a second arrow took him in the throat. From the woods, a dozen figures emerged. Men and women. Ute warriors, their faces grim, armed with bows and rifles. Jedediah stared, his rifle lowering in disbelief. An old Ute man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, stepped forward. "The trapper brought us word," he said to Jedediah in his own language. "He said the son of Thomas Carter was making his stand. We owed your father a debt. Today, we pay it." Sheriff Fletcher and his remaining men saw the warriors and their courage broke. They scrambled for their horses and fled back down the mountain, leaving their wounded behind. The battle was over. The truth, when it finally came out, washed over the town of Redemption like a flood. The U.S. Marshals arrived, armed with the real deed in Jedediah's testimony. Pearl McKinn's empire, built on a single greasy lie, crumbled into dust. Sheriff Fletcher was stripped of his badge and thrown in his own jail. The town of Redemption had a chance to live up to its name. A few months later, Annie Mae stood with Jedediah on the porch of a new house, built with timber from the land that was now rightfully hers. Her mother sat in a rocking chair, a warm blanket over her lap, watching the sunset. The silence between Annie Mae and Jedediah was no longer a question. It was an answer. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It felt like coming home. He had spent 15 years waiting for justice. She had spent a lifetime searching for her own worth. They had found both, here, in this quiet valley, where a stolen past had given way to a shared future. Sometimes, the world tries to bury you. It tries to tell you you're worthless, a burden, a mistake. It casts you out into the cold and hopes you disappear. But this story reminds us that dignity isn't something a town can give you or take away. It's something you carry inside you. And sometimes, the greatest treasures, the truest families, aren't found in the warmth of the town square, but out in the storm, with the other outcasts who were brave enough to stand their ground. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these tales of the Old West can travel. And don't forget to subscribe, because justice may be slow, but it's always worth the wait, and we've got plenty more stories of it coming your way.